Welcome back. We've just created an array in C++ to hold items, and we've assigned an inventory slot index variable on each weapon slot. So now we can bind some of these properties. We're going to start with the background image, which we have a default background image set to uncommon background, which is just a blue background. We're going to set this based on a property on the weapon itself. So let's get started. We're going to select background image here, and we're going to click bind and create binding. Let's go ahead and create a new variable, and I'm going to call this empty slot outline. We're going to change the type of this to be slate brush. This allows us to have a variable that can store an image. We're going to give this a default value. Now we have to compile first in order to give it a default value. Now you can see down in the details panel at the very bottom, there's a default value section, and if we click the drop down for empty slot outline, we can select an image. And I'm going to select inventory select button 2 as the default image. Now we're also going to add a new variable, and this will be for our shooter character. So let's create a variable called shooter character BP, and we're going to select the variable type and change this to shooter character BP, and it's going to be an object reference. Now when we're getting the background image, we're going to check to see if shooter character BP is valid. So we're going to drag that out, get it, and use an isValid node. The one with the question mark, of course, and we're going to check to see if it's valid. And if it's not, we need to get player pawn. So we're going to use a get player pawn node and cast that to shooter character BP. So drag off and type cast to shooter character BP, hook that up, and then we'll set the value for shooter character BP. And by the way, if you hold Alt and click and drag, we'll get the setter version by default. So this way we'll have a valid shooter character. Now what we need to do in order to get the background image is we need to check to see if our inventory array has an element at the given slot index. So we can create a new function that will take an index as well as the character and then return a Boolean that will be true if the inventory has an item in that array. So let's create a function. So let's click add new function, and let's call this function weapon in slot. Now for this function, click on the node weapon in slot, and let's take a look at the details panel down here. And you'll see that there's an inputs and an outputs. Now we can add input parameters for this function. Click to add a new input parameter, change its type to integer, and we're going to call this index. Let's click plus to add a new parameter again and choose shooter character BP for the type, and we're going to change the input name for this to be character. So now you'll see the weapon in slot function has two inputs, index and character. We're going to add an output for this, and we're going to change the type to Boolean, and this is going to say in slot. And this will return true if there's an item in the slot for our inventory array. So in order to check this, we need to get our character, and from the character we're going to type inventory, and we'll get that inventory, and you'll see this icon with a bunch of squares. This is the array icon. So we basically know that this inventory variable is an array. It's exposed to blueprints thanks to uProperties. Now inventory, we can drag off of this, and there's a node called isValidIndex. And what this does is it takes an index and returns a Boolean if there's a valid item in the index. So we're going to pass our index in to isValidIndex. And then this, we can simply hook up the output to the return node. Now this is almost enough for us, but we need to make sure that if there is a valid index, that is not a null A item pointer. We want to make sure that it actually holds a valid item. In other words, if there is a weapon at that slot, then we know that we can access its background image. If there's a null pointer there, well, the array has an element there, but it's null. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our inventory, drag off of that, and type get. And we're going to use get a copy. And then we'll take the index for our weapon in slot function and plug that in. And we're going to get this and cast it to a base weapon. So cast to base weapon BP. We're going to hook up the execution pin to this. And if this cast is successful, then we can return true. So I'd like to create a new local variable for this function and make this a Boolean variable. And I'm going to call this return value. And I'm going to set return value to true if this cast succeeds. So if the cast succeeds, I'll set this to true. And if the cast fails, then I'll set this to false. And we'll hook these both up. That way, we can simply use return value for here. And the isValidIndex, well, we'll use this as a condition for whether or not to proceed. So we're going to use a branch here, and isValidIndex will be the condition, and if that is a valid index, then we'll proceed. Otherwise, if it's not a valid index, well, then we're going to simply set return value to false. So we'll do this, set it equal to false, and then we'll simply hook up the execution pin to the end here. Now I'm going to double click to add a reroute node to keep our wires a little bit more organized. Okay, so we have this weapon in slot function that will return a Boolean. Let's go back to our get background image function. And after we check to make sure we have a valid shooter character, we can simply call this weapon in slot function. So right click, type weapon in slot, and we'll call weapon in slot. And we'll go ahead and hook up the execution pins for both cases into weapon in slot. And what we're going to pass in for character is our shooter character BP. And for index, since we're in our weapon slot widget and we have a slot index, we're going to pass slot index in as the index. That way we're checking to see if the inventory array has a valid element in this slot index. Now we have a Boolean telling us whether or not there's a weapon in the slot. So we can make a branch node and use that Boolean. And if there is not a valid weapon in the slot, well, then we can simply return the default value for the slate brush. And in fact, we can create a local variable to store that default value. So let's create a new local variable. This is going to be a slate brush. And I'm going to call this empty slot outline. So if there is no weapon in the slot, then we can simply return the empty slot outline. So we can create a local variable that we can return here and set the value of that. So let's add a new local variable. It's going to be a slate brush, and I'm going to call this return brush. So return brush. And we can set return brush here in the false case equal to empty slot outline. And the return node will simply get a return brush returned at the end here. So we'll hook that up. But what if the weapon in slot returns true when there's an actual weapon in the slot? What are we going to set our return brush to? Well, we want each weapon to have a value for its icon background. And in order to do that, we're going to need to add a texture variable to the weapon class. In fact, we can add that to the item class in case we want items in the inventory as well. So let's go ahead and go back to C++ to the item.h header file, and let's add a uTexture2D. So it's going to be a uTexture2D. It's going to be a pointer, and I'm going to call this icon background. This is the type that we need for a texture. Now we're going to give this uProperty edit anywhere, so we can set this in blueprints. Blueprint read only, so we can't set it in the blueprint event graph. And I'm going to give this a category of inventory, and we'll give it the meta specifier. Now I'm going to give this a comment and say background for this item in the inventory. So let's go ahead and compile this. Okay, so we've compiled, and I'm going to go into our weapons folder and base weapon, open up base weapon BP, and scroll down and look for that icon background. Now let's go ahead and give this a default. I'm just going to select one at random. Let's use rare background, and that's the purple one. So go ahead and compile that. Now let's go back into weapon slot, and we're in this weapon in slot function. Now if there is a weapon in the slot, we should return it. So here in the weapon in slot function, we can add another output. So let's add another output parameter. We're going to call this weapon. And this will be of type base weapon BP. And now our return node has a weapon output. Now, in the case that the cast succeeds, this will have a valid weapon, and we can simply plug it straight to the output here. Now, in the case where the cast fails, this will be null, but that's okay because we'll know that it failed because return value will be false. Go ahead and compile. Now back in the get background image function, we now see that our weapon in slot returns a weapon. So in the true case where we actually have a weapon in the slot, we can get that weapon and we can access its icon background property that we just created in C++. So we're going to say get icon background, and we can use this to set our return brush. So let's get a setter for return brush, and notice that this is a texture 2D object reference, but this return brush is a slate brush. So what we can do is we can get our icon background texture 2D, drag off of it and type make slate brush. And this creates a slate brush, and we can use that to set return brush. Now all we need to do is hook up the true execution pin and then hook the result of this up to return node. And now return brush is set to the icon background. Now we can compile and test this out. So let's go ahead and compile. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and hit play. And now you'll see that the default weapon slot has that purple background, and the others have just the outline here. And that's because we don't have any items in those elements of the array. Now we still see the icon for the gun, and that's because we haven't bound that to anything yet, and we're going to do that in the future videos. So we will continue with this in the next video. So stay tuned.